We are in the Living Things chapter, and we're going to take a look at what life is. Since we are going to be spending the majority of the year talking about things that are alive, we need to give a definition of something that is alive, and our first definition is an organism. So an organism is going to be a living thing. And so from this point forward, anytime that I refer to an organism, it's a living thing, and so a living thing is an organism. And since we're talking about organisms and how they are alive, we should probably talk about how they are developed and begin. And to start with, we need to know what the most basic and simple form of an organism starts as is going to be a cell. All living things or organisms are going to be made up out of cells. And cells are the basic unit of structure in living things. So all things are going to be made up out of cells. And we break cells down into two equal parts. There are going to be unicellular organisms, which are going to be only one-celled organisms. They only have one cell. And there's also going to be multicellular organisms, which are going to be two or more cells. And as we increase the number of cells, the organism is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so an example of a multicellular organism is going to be a human being. An example of a unicellular organism is going to be a bacteria. Okay, so these ones are small, and these ones are going to be larger, especially as they increase in the number of cells. Okay, so organisms are living things, and all living things are made up out of cells, and the cells get broken down into two groups, unicellular and multicellular. Now, all organisms are going to have certain characteristics that they share. One of the characteristics they share is going to be the presence or the makeup of chemicals, which means that all organisms are going to be made up out of things like proteins and carbohydrates and lipids or fats, which is a lipid, and then they obviously also have water. Okay, so all organisms are going to share the development of these things. Another thing that they're all going to have is energy, and they're going to get that energy from their source of food. So in plants, we know that their source of food is going to be the sun, because it's photosynthesis that transfers the energy into a sugar for the plant. And for other organisms that are not able to photosynthesize, they have to have a source of food that they're going to be able to get their energy from. A response is going to be the way that the organism reacts to a stimulus. A response and stimulus work together. The stimulus is going to be the thing that is causing the response. So it's the event that causes the response. So if I was in class and I had a big 5-gallon ice cold bucket of water, and I walked up to one of you and dumped it on top of you, your reaction that you would have would be to probably jump up and maybe scream and flinch extremely fast. And so what's happening is that the stimulus is going to be causing the response. Me dumping the water on you is going to be the stimulus. The response is the fact that you're going to get up quickly and flinch and maybe even scream. Another type of characteristic that all living things share is going to be the idea of growth and development. The idea of growth is the fact that an organism is going to get larger. The development means that it's going to mature and undergo many changes that are going to cause the organism to become more complex. So it's going to become more complex. For example, in human beings, when we're babies, we have very, very small hands and feet. And as we get older, they begin to grow, get larger, but they also become more developed. You're able to do a lot more things with them. And the last thing that they all share is going to be reproduction. Organisms understand that if they are not able to reproduce, they are going to become extinct. And so extinction is obviously not something that the organisms want to do. So again, from this section, we learned that an organism is a living thing, and all living things are made up out of cells. And there are two different types of cells. It's either going to be a unicellular cell or it's going to be a multicellular cell. And then all organisms share these characteristics. And so we're going to call these characteristics that they all share. All right. Now, long ago, science wasn't nearly as developed as it is today. People would see a moth that came from a closet, or they would see something that came up from the ground, whether it was just in the grass, and they would think that what was happening is that there was reproduction was occurring. And to you and I, it seems kind of silly to think that a moth or some type of fly would come out of the closet and people would think that there was reproduction that was occurring. But that wasn't how the people back long ago used to think. And so we enter in our first scientist. His name is Francesco Redi. He was an Italian doctor, and one of the experiments that he set up was this idea of spontaneous generation, or he was trying to disprove the idea of spontaneous generation, and to prove the idea that life comes from life. And so he set up this experiment where, and I'll show you a picture in a second of it, but the idea was that he had basically these jars of meat, and so he put like a slab of meat into the jar. And on one of the jars, he left it wide open, and so the top of it was open. Another one, he put a chunk of meat in there, and he ultimately had this cheesecloth over the top of it, or some type of cloth over the top. And he did one other one in which he again had the meat, and this time he sealed the top of it, so he sealed off. And so what happened is that on the one that was open, there started to become these little maggots that started to grow on the meat. And after time, there started to be these flies, and yes, that is a fly, that began to come and leave this jar. And so this idea that organisms were coming from this meat was showing the fact that, was it the meat that was giving off these types of this new life to exist? Over on the cloth one, there was no maggots that were found on the meat. However, there were some flies. I guess I'll just write it here for you. There were some flies that were found on the cheesecloth, and they were hovering around there and buzzing around, but yet there were none of them that were in the container. And the one that was sealed had no flies or maggots or anything on the inside, and there were no flies that were around here. And so what this did is it showed the people that that life does not come from non-living things. All right. So what it proved is that life needs to come from life. And again, it's just proving this idea that, and it was disproving the idea of spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation was the idea that living things could arise from non-living things. And so this experiment proved that the idea of spontaneous generation does not exist. However, the work by Redi was not very well accepted, and people just still were not willing to accept his idea. And so it was many years later that we enter in, and this is the example again where he has the different types of the different jars. This one doesn't show the cheesecloth, but you can see that there is the sealed containers and the open containers. Again, this showing that there is no life, and this one showing that the flies were basically leaving the larvae on the meat. And so that's an example of life coming from this non-living thing, but it wasn't actually coming from the non-living thing, it was actually coming from the flies that were basically creating this bacteria that was starting to grow into the maggots, and then the flies were also around the area. All right. Now, many years later, we enter in another scientist. This time his name is Louis Pasteur, and Louis Pasteur helped to finally prove this idea that the spontaneous generation was not accepted. Okay, so this becomes an idea that's not accepted. Even though Redi was the first one to kind of take us through and see it, people did not accept it until eventually Louis Pasteur was able to prove this. And so what Louis did in this experiment was he took kind of these flasks and they heated them up to the point where they were boiling, and then basically took off one of the tops of the flask and left the other one where it was basically going to be blocked, so no air could really get into this broth. And so what happened is that even though they were both boiled to prove that there was going to be at the beginning no bacteria, so there was no bacteria at the beginning, so that's the reason for boiling it, and so there's our symbol for heating. And what happens is that this one gets broken, so now air is exposed to be able to get into there, and this one it was basically blocked from the air getting up inside of there. And over time what happened is that there was bacteria that began to grow, and organisms grew inside of our beaker that was exposed. This one had no contamination of bacteria. And so again, this disproved the idea of spontaneous generation, once again proving that life must come from life. Okay, so that's the main take-home message. 2 experiments to show you the idea of spontaneous generation does not exist. Alright, so what are the needs of all living things? So what does every single organism need in order to survive? Well, they all need food. They need a source of food. And there are going to be 2 types of organisms. There are going to be ones that are going to be autotrophs, and there are going to be ones that are called heterotrophs. So let's start by talking about the autotrophs. In this picture, there is some evergreen trees, and the evergreen trees are able to go under a process called photosynthesis. And so we also call these autotrophs, which means that they are able to make their own food. Okay, so an autotroph is an organism that's able to make its own food. It undergoes the process of photosynthesis. Okay? The other one is going to be a heterotroph, which means that it is not going to be able to make its own food. It's going to have to get its own food. Okay, so in here we've got a porcupine, which is going to have to hunt after its own food, and so this one's going to have to track its own food down. We call that a heterotroph. This organism, the plant, is going to be able to use the sunlight to convert energy for itself through a process called photosynthesis. Another type of need of all living things is called stable internal conditions. We give a fancy definition to this one. We call it homeostasis. Homeostasis is the same thing as creating stable internal conditions. It means that it's creating equilibrium. And so what does that mean? That means that oftentimes our bodies are going to be under stressful situations, and we're going to have to regulate them. So if you're in gym class and you are out running and it's a warm day, your body is going to realize that it's hot, and it's going to begin to react. And the way that it's going to react is it's going to begin to sweat. That's your body's way of trying to cool itself. So an example of homeostasis is sweating. Okay, another way is in the winter time, if you're outside and you begin to shiver. Shivering is going to be contracting the muscles, and so it's going to allow for the body to warm up. It's going to try to generate energy by making the muscles contract. And so shivering is going to be another way of creating homeostasis. But again, all living things need to be able to keep themselves in check. If they drink too much water, then obviously they need to get rid of some of the excess material that's in them. When they eat too much, they have to get rid of that material. So our bodies undergo all kinds of equilibrium balances that we call homeostasis. Another need for all living things is going to be water. All living things need water, and so in this picture there's a moose that's drinking water and supplying itself. We all need living space, and so you need to have like a shelter or a space where you are going to be able to survive. And so in the picture there's an owl it's in a tree, and so it has a place where it's going to be able to live and seek protection. So those are the 4 needs that all living things share, and so I hope this was helpful.